So as you know, I do tend to blab on in lectures, and when I'm talking about pathophysiology, I blab on even more because it is an interesting subject, and I love talking about it. So I will. I'm trying to keep my lecture lengths down to 15 minutes, but a lot of them are more like 27 to 35 minutes. So sorry. You can always break them up. You don't have to listen to them in one shot. So just so you know. So we're going to talk about levels of evidence at this point. So we really want to have our physical therapy practice and then medical practice for other people in the health professions. We really want it to be evidence-based, meaning there's research that supports that the interventions we are providing are effective and appropriate. Okay, so we're going to talk about the different levels of evidence, and some of the information that I'm going to give you here is from the review material for the PTA board exam. And of course, what does that mean? It means that it's probably going to be, there's probably going to be some question about it on the board exam. So it's always good to know these things. So, and there's information in the book, but I'm going to add a little bit of information. So the stages of the research process, stage 1 includes basic science, which is, chemistry, immunology, biology, and it's the work that's done in the laboratory. A lot of times it's animal or cell tissue cultures. It's your basic science where we're kind of getting the basic level down. The animal and cell tissue cultures, or what they call them in vitro studies, are not considered to be evidence for interventions, but they are what we base the next stage on. So the next stage in the research process is a small number of human subjects. So a good example of this is the testing of new medications. So they'll do the basic science first, and then they will work with a small number of human subjects. Stage 3, they go into clinical trials that involve larger numbers of patients with the disease or risk of the disease. And the double-blind study, or the randomized controlled trial, is sort of like the gold standard of clinical research. So a randomized controlled trial is where you have a test group and a control group. The test group is getting the new intervention, whether it's a medication or a treatment of some kind. The control group is either getting the standard intervention or no intervention, and then you compare the two. With blinding, a single blind study, the participants in the study do not know who's getting the new treatment and who's getting the standard treatment. But the researchers do know. Double-blind studies means the researchers don't know who's getting the intervention and who's getting the standard treatment, and the participants don't know. So double-blind study is considered to be more objective. It takes some of the bias, hopefully, out of the research. That's the hope. So when we start to talk about the levels of evidence, when I have you do research projects and whatnot, I want you to find papers that are in the top tier of evidence. So the top tier of evidence are those first two boxes on the top of the pyramid: randomized controlled trials and systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and I'll talk about each one of these. The next level of evidence is cohort studies, case control studies, cross-sectional studies, and case reports and series. And then the lowest level is ideas and opinions. And really, ideas and opinions are great, but they are not considered scientific evidence. So you might see something on YouTube, and there's a lot of good information on YouTube, but it's not scientific evidence. You have to go back to the original research. So hopefully people are posting their references as well, and you get that. So talking about what's considered the top tier level of evidence, the systematic review is a comprehensive review of medical literature that uses explicit analysis methods to systematically search, identify, appraise, and summarize all of the literature on a specific issue. So the nice thing about a systematic review, it's like a researcher went in and did that all for you, so you don't have to read the individual articles. But a systematic review, because it broadly looks at a lot of different studies, it's considered a top-tier level of evidence. A meta-analysis is a systematic review that uses a statistical technique to derive an estimate of effect size by combining the results of several randomized controlled trials to determine the overall effectiveness of a treatment. The good thing about a meta-analysis is it minimizes the problem of small sample size from individual studies because it pools trials that increase the overall sample size. So that's the advantage of a meta-analysis. It takes several different randomized controlled trials and combines them together and increases the sample size. So a randomized controlled trial is a form of experimental research used to assess the relative effect of a specific intervention compared to a control condition. So participants or patients are randomized into a control group and at least one experimental group. The control group receives either no treatment or a standard default treatment, and the test group receives the new intervention, the one that's being tested. So ideally, the groups will be identical except for the intervention. And the randomized part is that people are randomly assigned to the groups. So it's not like you say, oh, well, you're most likely to benefit, so I'm going to put you in the test group. That's not what it is. It's random. So when you volunteer to be in a randomized control trial, you might be getting the new treatment, but you might not. And here's where the single blind versus double blind comes in. If it's single blinded, the participants don't know which group they're in. If it's double-blinded, then neither the participants nor the primary researcher know which group they're in. So those three are considered the top tier of levels of evidence, and when you're doing a paper, I want you to find these things. Okay, other levels of evidence, which are also valid, but they're not top tier, they're kind of considered lower tier evidence. A cohort study is a type of longitudinal observational study where you take individuals with a risk factor or exposure and you follow them over time to compare the occurrence of a disease in the exposed group to that of a group of unexposed individuals. The measure of association between exposure and disease in cohort studies is the relative risk. So the classic cohort study that went on for about 30 years was the Framingham Heart Study. In Framingham, Massachusetts, they studied really almost the whole town for 30 years and compared cardiac disease risk factors to what disease actually developed. And a lot of the American Heart Association dietary and exercise recommendations came out of the Framingham Heart Study. So it's, even though it's considered a lower tier of evidence, it can show high correlations between things, but you can't necessarily infer a cause and effect relationship. You can say these things are highly correlated, you might have more of a risk, but it doesn't prove a cause and effect relationship. So a case control study is another type of retrospective observational study this is with individuals who already have a particular disease and they're compared to a group that doesn't have the disease. So you're comparing the people that have the disease to people that don't have the disease. The history of exposure or other characteristics prior to the onset of disease is recorded by interviews and other sources and compared with the two groups. So the control group provides an estimate of the frequency and amount of exposure in the population who don't have the disease. So different things can be learned from a case control study, but again, it's considered a lower tier of evidence. A cross-sectional study is similar to cohort or case control studies, but the data or observations are taken at only one point in time, and all of the subjects are tested at relatively the same time. So it's sort of a snapshot of what's going on. Cross-sectional studies are trying to describe relationships between a disease or condition and factors of interest that might exist in a specified population at a given time. So it's going to give you some information, but it's not going to show cause and effect. A case report or a case series, it's an in-depth description of one individual's condition or response to a treatment. A case series consists of a collection of observations of similar cases. So case reports may be used to generate theories and hypotheses for future resource, but they can't test hypotheses or establish cause and effect relationships. So that is one of the reasons why these things are considered lower tier evidence. A randomized control study can show a cause and effect relationship. They can say, if we didn't give the person the treatment, this is what happened, and if we did, this is what happened. Cause and effect. But the lower tier evidence really cannot establish those cause and effect relationships. So hopefully that makes sense. So part of what any healthcare professional does before treating a patient is they take a medical history. The medical history consists of current and prior illnesses, allergies, hospitalizations, prior surgeries, that sort of thing, what treatments they've received, any specific difficulties the patient is currently having, any type of therapy or drugs they've received, including prescription, non-prescription, and herbal supplements and food supplements. So you want to know the total picture of what that person is doing that brought them into the clinic. So hopefully that makes sense. So when you take the medical history, you're trying to get a big picture of what's going on. Usually there's a form that you have the patients fill out when they're like an intake form, and then the health professional asks some follow-up questions to sort of clarify the patient's current condition and identify any potential problems, and also to try to help determine what they need. Do they need education? Do they need intervention? Do they need further tests? That sort of thing. Do they need to be referred to another healthcare practitioner? So all healthcare practitioners do that medical history as an intake. And you can learn a lot from the past medical history. So new developments and trends are happening all the time in medicine. There's constant updating of information and knowledge. So you can't just learn it and then sit back on what you know and not ever update your knowledge. There are always improved diagnostic tests, development of new treatments and more effective drugs, new technologies. There's always research going on in efforts to prevent, control, or cure many disorders. So I have hope that in my lifetime there's going to be a cure for Parkinson's or a cure for MS, because lots of research is going on. And so it's always, as healthcare professionals, it's important to update our information and knowledge.